Alright, so picking up right where we left off, today we're going to discuss fear, which is the central theme for the course. Remember in the last lesson we talked about individual and community, how one way into studying, interpreting, understanding a literary text is looking at the community in the text, the relationship between the individual and the community, the national ideologies and narratives that contain beliefs, values, morals, that community ascribes to and perpetuates, and how those narratives and ideologies affect the relationship between the community and the individual, and what those effects eventually lead to. Perhaps alienation or isolation, making the individual either into an insider or an outsider. That insider-outsider dichotomy can be important for understanding how the community functions and understanding the meaning of the message the author is trying to convey. Sometimes the outsider can even become a villain or a monster. And when that happens, they can represent fears that the community has, because the outsider almost always disrupts, the normal narrative, the normal ideology of the community. So today, we're turning our attention, or for this lesson, we're turning our attention toward fear. And again, fear is a theme for the course, because the secondary world reflects the primary world. By looking at the community in the secondary world and understanding how it works, we can understand the secondary world and thus the primary world better, and seeing what fears that community has as represented through the outsiders, the villains, can help us understand that community, the secondary world, and the primary world. So, going along with what I just said, symbols, often villains, in literary works often represent our fears, or common fears felt by society, even fears that play an important role in national ideologies. Last time I talked a little bit about Batman Begins and Iron Man, and these are the two films I think that are a really good example to use here, because comic book films have become much more popular in recent years, so a lot of you have probably seen these movies and can relate to the examples. As I mentioned last time, the villains in these films are essentially terrorists. But what's interesting is they've changed this a little bit from the comics. In the comics, the League of Shadows or League of Assassins were more like assassins or ninjas rather than Middle Eastern terrorists. They're not Middle Eastern in the film, but they behave like terrorists, and so that's what they represent. And Iron Man is a really interesting change, because in the comics, the Mandarin is his arch enemy, and in the first Iron Man film from 2008, instead of being abducted by the Mandarin and inventing the Iron Man suit while being held captive by the Mandarin, he's captured by this Middle Eastern terrorist group that resembles Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and they're called the Ten Rings. And so it's a nod to the Mandarin, because he derives his power from 10 rings he wears on his fingers, but it's a completely different, incarnation. And it's an interesting change, because had these movies been made before 9/11, perhaps the characters wouldn't have been changed. They would have represented something else. Obviously, fear and paranoia about another terrorist attack is an obvious fear to have in the time we live in, and so it makes sense for the villains to represent these fears. The Mandarin being Chinese and Iron Man being captured in China in the comics rather than the Middle East by a Middle Eastern terrorist group might reflect fears of, say, communism or something, since the comics, the original first Iron Man comics, were published in the 60s. Now, in the 21st century, post 9/11, you have terrorists instead. So, the fears our nation feels at the time are often represented by the villains, because they're the villains, the outsiders, the enemy. One thing I find very interesting, though, about Ra's al Ghul, the leader of the League of Shadows in Batman Begins, is he's a somewhat sympathetic character. We can certainly relate to his motives. He and Batman actually share the same motives. The difference is the means of carrying out their motives. That's the central conflict of the film, is they disagree on the means, not the motives. And so villains are oftentimes characters we can sympathize with. I once read an introduction to a graphic novel I was reading, and the author of the introduction said he loved the villain characters. They were always his favorites to read, and he liked villains because if they were compelling enough and interesting enough, then sometimes you'd almost root for them to win more than the hero because they were so interesting. Heroes usually give us more of what we expect, where villains give us the unknown. So that can be terrifying, but it can also be intriguing. And so along those lines, Ra's al Ghul is a very sympathetic villain in Batman Begins. That said, what he represents, the kind of fear he represents, is very different from another type of fear. The reason we're sympathetic to him is we can identify with his motives, even if we disagree with his means. But some characters lack motive. The Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge coined the term motiveless malignity in reference to the villain Iago from Shakespeare's play Othello. We're going to talk about Shakespeare more in the next lecture. But Iago is a villain who convinces Othello his wife is having an affair, which leads to Othello's downfall and other catastrophic events for the community. And Iago says things at times that could indicate he has a motive. Othello may be having an affair with his wife, but Iago is really smart enough to know that that's not true. And he says these things to make it seem like he has a motive, and he says different things that could be his motive throughout, and they contradict each other at times. So he really has no motive. And that in itself is terrifying. He's malignant, but for no particular reason why. What this reminds me of is another Batman villain from the next film, the sequel to Batman Begins, the Joker in The Dark Knight, Heath Ledger's famous portrayal. Because there doesn't seem to be, he cites, like Iago, he cites different motives at different times that seem to contradict each other. And you don't know which one is the true motive or if he even has a motive. And what both these characters, what they really want to do is a quote, I think of a quote about what they really want to do from a Yeats poem we'll read later in the semester, which is mere anarchy loosed upon the world. And so the idea here is they want to introduce chaos. They want to disrupt order, is what they really want to do. They don't want revenge. They don't want profit. There's several scenes in The Dark Knight that make me think of Iago directly. Alfred is telling Batman of when he worked in a forest hunting a jewel thief, and the jewel thief, when they found him, he was throwing the jewels into the river. He wasn't using them for profit because he wanted to stir up chaos. And he says, you don't understand that kind of motive, so you don't understand the villain you're dealing with in the Joker. The Joker even says himself when he's talking to Harvey Dent that, all it took was a couple of barrels of gasoline and some bullets for me to, mix things up. And Harvey Dent lives his life by order because he has a coin he flips, but he can control it because it's the same on both sides. And then the coin, like his face, becomes scarred, and the Joker convinces him to mix things up, stir up some chaos, make it more random. What does this tell us? That we as people like to have order. We like to know that there are rules and laws, both legal ones and laws of nature, and a sense of justice, that things make sense and they're going to work out the way they should. And once anarchy and chaos come into play and order gets messed up, that's terrifying. And so the Joker and Iago represent that fear, that order is going to go by the wayside. It's very different than Ra's al Ghul, who wants to impose his own order, and we can kind of understand the motive for that order, even if we disagree with it. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is a wide spectrum of different fears with these examples from recent films. You can have villains who want to impose order and villains who want to do away with order, and they represent very different things, very different fears, and there's a whole other array of characters in between there. So what are we afraid of as a nation? Losing order, invasion by terrorists. These villains represent these things. They tell us something about our nation. We like democracy, we like order, we like justice, we want to be safe. Looking at the villains reveals our fears. Those tell us something about our identity. So looking at a community and a literary text can do the same thing for the community in the text and the society it comes from. So Tolkien talks about fear directly in his essay The Monster and the Critics. I know this is somewhat of a baggy essay, so to speak. It's very dense and very long. If you've already read it, read the whole thing and understood it, hats off to you. If you haven't yet, hopefully this lecture will help, or if you have and you've struggled with it, hopefully it will help. And also if you have it and you're going to read it after the lecture, know that this is one where you can probably skim, read the first few paragraphs, read the first lines of paragraphs, get a general idea of it, because it's a dense and baggy one. But it's very important, so I want to take you through it and help clarify some of it. This goes back to what we were talking about with literature review a couple lessons ago, and the idea of citing the previous critics and responding to those critics. And the critical consensus that Tolkien observed when he was researching Beowulf is that scholars basically treated it as a historical document and said that's why it was important. And he said, no, wait, that's wrong. It's more than that. It's a literary text. It's a work of art. So what does it mean that it's a historical document? It tells us a little bit about Anglo-Saxon history. The thing that's interesting about Beowulf in terms of Anglo-Saxon history is that it's translated by Christians living in Great Britain, but it's originally a Scandinavian folk legend. If you know much about the canon, you know that Beowulf is always the first thing in the canon of British literature. So, why is it set in Scandinavia? Why is it the Scandinavian folk legend if it's the first piece of British literature? Well, it was the very first translation was done by Christian monks living in England. And prior to that, England had not really been a unified nation. It had been under siege from the Romans and other Germanic tribes, and it was kind of these disparate tribes spread throughout. And in the 10th century, around the same time Christianity started to take hold, and this is kind of a big summary. I'm not doing specific dates. I'm just kind of giving you a general time frame. But in the 10th century, when some of those tribes started to unify and also become Christian at the same time, Beowulf was translated just prior to that, the first ever translation. So you see threads creeping in where you can tell this is not a Christian story and not in an English setting, but there's certain references where you can tell, oh, the person translating this is a Christian. And so it marks that transition. And scholars said, it's important for this reason. It reflects an important part of our history in that sense. But the content doesn't matter that much. And so that's where Tolkien takes issue. He says, hey, wait, the context matters. The content matters, excuse me. It's a literary text. It's a work of art. We should look at the art. We should look at the content. So part of that art, part of that content is the monsters, which is very interesting because, this is the 1950s, I believe, or earlier actually, early to mid 20th century when Tolkien's writing this. So, looking at monsters in a literary text is a new idea then. And so this marks an important point in the history of literary criticism. And Tolkien's reasoning for why the monsters is important, in part, is because he's a Christian. But this connects to it. This is a way in for him to connect with the previous scholars and say, hey, this is the reason why we can look at that as a work of art. Because Christians believe that they are aliens and exiles in a hostile world that has fallen from sin, and their true place, if they can achieve it, is in heaven. And because Beowulf is constantly under siege and attack and has to fight all these monsters, he's clearly living in a hostile world. So it reflects that Christian belief. And so that's Tolkien's reasoning for why this can be studied as a work of art, is a way to reach those other critics. He goes beyond that, though, in talking about what the monsters represent. They also represent certain fears, such as the fear of growing old. I just asked you to read the first of the 3 sections of Beowulf. He eventually grows old and doesn't die in battle, but or he does, but he's very old then. So it's about the fear of growing old to a certain extent, and because the monsters pose a threat to his life, they represent that fear. So this is one of the many fears they could represent. And I'm asking you to see what some of the other ones are in the discussion board post if you choose Beowulf for the post. So this is an important turn in literary criticism, because literary criticism is just starting out at this time, and like Tolkien's text on fairy stories, he's saying there's something more here. Look at the supernatural elements. Look at the secondary world. Look at it as art and not just as a historical document. So it's really kind of the start of literary criticism. Tolkien isn't always credited with that, but it really is the start of literary criticism because he's saying, study this as literature. It'd be easy at the time, for scholars to say, oh, monsters aren't important, they're kind of silly. No, monsters are important because they're part of the art. And they can tell us things about our fears, which tell us things about the primary world, about ourselves, our identity, our culture. So let's take a look at the literary text for this lesson before I turn you loose onto the discussion board. Looking closer at Beowulf, this is an important text for several reasons. I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about mythology, that it could be considered an epic. Tolkien, if you read the essay, doesn't like to call it an epic. It certainly fits the criteria for the genre of an epic because you have a hero, maybe somewhat flawed, maybe a little prideful, but for the most part is a good king, and thus represents how one should behave in society, like Rama or Achilles does, like those characters do, and goes on a journey, fights battles, so it fits in the epic genre. It's a long poem. I think the reason Tolkien doesn't want it to be considered an epic is because that puts into this category of things that came before, and he wants it to be appreciated for its uniqueness. It's not so much he doesn't think it's an epic, he wants it to be read in a way that it hadn't been read before. It's also one of the oldest Western stories. Now, Greece and Rome are certainly part of the Western world rather than the East, but in most university literature departments at universities in the U.S. and England, you have American literature and British literature as the primary focus. You may have world literature in other fields, but the majority, unless you're specializing in something else that you'll encounter in your classes, is going to be British and American literature. Obviously, British literature dates back further, and Beowulf, like I said earlier, is the first piece of British literature. So it's one of the older Western stories, depending on how you conceptualize the Western world and Western literature. There are multiple translations, which is another reason why it's important, so we'll talk about translation in a minute. And then finally, it's also an important text because Beowulf is an example of an ideal king. We've talked a lot about the villains, about heroes, in contrast to villains. If villains represent the things we're afraid of as a society, heroes then in turn represent, how we should behave. And that's an idea, again, dating back to the myths that we've talked about already. So, along those lines, what are some of the other fears, aside from the fear of growing old and dying from old age, that the monsters, the villains in Beowulf could represent? I've only asked you to look at the first section. There are 3 sections. In each section he fights a different monster. First Grendel, then Grendel's mother, and finally the dragon. So by looking at Grendel's mother and the dragon for a minute, I can talk about other fears that are represented by the text monsters without stepping on your toes on the discussion board and maybe help guide you in your responses that way. And I find Grendel's mother to be interesting because it's Grendel's mother, not Grendel's father. Thinking about the secondary world of this text, it's certainly a man's world. There aren't really any female characters. Hrothgar's daughter is mentioned, but she does not play a significant role. And if you think back to the literary texts that we've looked at that are the forefathers of this text, the Iliad, etc., that's very much a man's world too. I mean, the closest thing this resembles is an epic, and with the exception of Sita and the Ramayana, the epics we've looked at and the other ones out there, they're very much a man's world as well, the world-based, secondary world they built. The women are treated as prizes and not as people in the Iliad. So in this kind of man's world of the secondary world, the feminine or the female is other. We'll talk more about what it means to be the other or to be otherized later in the semester, but they're unknown. They're not understood by the male characters, and people fear what they don't understand. So the feminine form can be frightening in literary texts, and we'll talk about that more in Macbeth and Dracula, but here you kind of have that with Grendel's mother. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about, it being Grendel's mother, not Grendel's father. The dragon in the third part clearly represents greed. That's a little more straightforward. He's surrounded by all these coins and objects. It's a very old kind of myth going back to dragons. So this society clearly disapproved of greed as an impulse. So going beyond the other villains and the other monsters in the poem and what they could represent, what are some important things about it? The translations. Because of some of the translation work, this poem has become much more popular in recent years. It benefited from Seamus Heaney's translation, which we'll talk about in a minute, and also the movie with Ray Winstone and Angelina Jolie. So if you've seen that movie or you've heard about Beowulf, it's kind of part of pop culture now the way it wasn't before. So one question I pose to you, and as we get further in the semester, I want to start posing more questions during the lessons and giving you time to think about them, is what is significant to you about it? How have you encountered it as part of pop culture? Is it part of mythology now because of these recent pop culture developments? Seamus Heaney's translation. So this is the point about translation. The quote, every translation is an interpretation, is very important here and in general. And translation is an important issue in literary studies that we may not get much of a chance to touch on again, so I want to touch on it here. Translators always make choices, and that's why every translation is an interpretation. There are other very straightforward, more direct translations that follow the original text of Beowulf very closely that I could have given you. Instead, I've given you Seamus Heaney's translation for a couple reasons. One is that it made the poem much more popular. The other is that it takes great liberties with the original text. And he uses a lot of adjectives, and the language is very beautiful. So in that sense, it's entertaining and fun to read, and that's why it became popular. But it also illustrates the liberties a translator can take. So we won't really have a chance to analyze that, but it's good background to have reading this version if you encounter issues with translation in other classes you take. Two things that Heaney changed or embellished in his translation. He made the language more descriptive with more adjectives so people see it as more poetic, more artistic, and that's why it's popular. The other is the adjectives he chooses to describe the settings make it feel more like Northern Ireland and less like Scandinavia, which Ireland is considered a post-colonial country. And we'll talk about post-colonialism more later in the semester, but essentially countries that were once colonies of superpowers, especially Great Britain, like Ireland. And it's still war-torn because there's civil war because of debate over whether to belong to Great Britain, the United Kingdom or not. And so this war-torn Ireland is represented somewhat because of the way Heaney embellishes the language of the poem. It looks more like Ireland than Scandinavia. So he takes great liberties, and some critics take him to task for that, but others also recognize how popular the poem became after his translation and appreciate that. It led to the movie. Okay, let's touch on the other literary texts real briefly, give you some background so that you can think about them. Remember, you can choose between Beowulf or any of the other texts. If you choose Beowulf, focus on Grendel, and aside from the fear of growing old, what other fears could the monster, the villain there represent? Or you can choose one of the other texts. You don't have to write on all of them, just one. The first is the Bible. Some of you might be, why the Bible in a literature class? That's something Christians read, or that I read if I'm a Christian. But the Bible can also be studied as literature. And many of the images and symbols and themes in the Bible have become part of mythology to a certain extent, and they work like signifiers, like Achilles' heel. References to the serpent, people immediately think of the story of when Eve is tempted, regardless of their religious denomination or understanding of the Bible, because it's permeated our culture the way mythology has. So when you're getting an introduction to literature like this course is supposed to offer and a background in literary studies, the Bible, Christian or not, should be part of that curriculum. Also, in terms of this theme, the Bible is filled with some terrifying images. Certainly the serpent we just mentioned, but also the mark of Cain himself. as a villain, perhaps. You think about it in Beowulf, that's one of the places where you can see, you remember why it was considered historical significance was it was first translated by Christians in England, even though it was a Scandinavian folk legend. So you see the Scandinavian tale playing out, then you see these Christian references, and one of them is that Grendel is marked with the mark of Cain. So the serpent, Cain, any other terrifying image you see in Genesis, if you choose to write on the passages from Genesis, please feel free to do so and talk about what possible fear that image or that villain or that monster could represent. The other three pieces I've chosen are short poems. These are going to be the last poems we look at this semester now that we're moving on to other literary forms and genres. And so before we moved on, we will look at some poetry in the last lesson, but until then, this is the last we're looking at. And it'll be Yeats again. So I wanted to give you something aside from Blake and Yeats before we move on to read and to write on the discussion board if you feel so inclined. So I'll give you a little bit of background on each author. They're all poets who wrote at least some shorter poems that I found particularly interesting, and I hope you enjoy too. John Donne is one of my favorite poets, and he is an 18th century metaphysical poet. The metaphysical poets were called that in part because of the spiritual element of their works, but also because of the complex ideas. And Donne's ideas are the most complex of that group. He's known for use of extended metaphors, which is a metaphor that extends over the whole poem. You think of that song, The Cave by Mumford & Sons we listened to, the person he's addressing, he's using the metaphor of a bear or an animal, because in the final verse he says, come out of your cave walking on your hands, and in the first verse he's talking about being a meat eater or a cannibal. So an extended metaphor is a metaphor that carries the whole way through the text. Donne will usually use one of these to advance a specific idea, concept, or philosophical viewpoint. Usually it's a dense idea that takes some unpacking. He's famous for these. So his poems almost function like a riddle, where you get more clues as you go, and he wants you to unravel this concept as you go, which is part of what I find fun about them. The famous poet T.S. Eliot, who you're probably familiar with, in the early 20th century kind of revived Donne. He said the poets of the previous century weren't challenging enough, and he wanted a more intellectually challenging poem and poet, and was responsible for helping revive Donne. So if you really like digging in deep and unpacking and playing with philosophical ideas, you might want to write on Donne for your post. And here the dream is the thing he's talking about, and there's a fear element involved. So what does the dream represent, and does it represent a fear? If so, what kind? If you choose Donne. Another option is Byron, who's a romantic poet. He was kind of the rock star of the Romantic age. He was known for writing long poems with a narrative structure and characters that are now known as Byronic heroes. Although this is longer than the other two poems we have for today aside from Beowulf, it's still one of his shorter works, and it's a very interesting poem. This darkness, it's essentially, if you've read it, you'll know, talking about the end of the world, which I find to be an interesting theme for a poem. And so certainly the fear of the end of the world is there, but there's much more you can do with fear in this poem. How do people behave in this situation? And what does the darkness represent, aside from the end of the world? How are people behaving? Why is that frightening? Why would this situation be frightening? There's a lot to think about there. So certainly fears to talk about that the darkness represents, but certainly going beyond the fear of the world ending in this poem. Finally, we have Emily Dickinson, who of these three poets you're probably most likely to be familiar with. Again, she's another favorite of mine because she writes short poems, but there's so much packed into her short poems. When I've taught Dickinson in classes, sometimes we can spend an hour on one poem. There's so much there, and it's something like 14 or 16 lines. She uses slant rhymes, which means the words are kind of similar, but they don't always rhyme in a traditional way, which kind of gets at her rebellious personality. She also uses personification, which is when you ascribe human qualities to inanimate objects, or even more human qualities to animals than they typically possess. The most famous example from her work is probably the line, "My life had stood a loaded gun." The opening line of that poem, "My life had stood a loaded gun," she's personifying the gun. Because there's so much to unpack, a wide variety of interpretations have arisen from her poems, and She had a turbulent relationship with Christianity because she didn't really feel like she belonged. She was a recluse. She didn't feel like she belonged in the Christian community in Amherst where she lived. And she also had an obsession with death. I'm not sure why, but it's very interesting. So different poems, she represents varying views on Christianity and on death. It's not like she was locked into one view if you read her canon of poetry. This poem is a lesser-known one, and it's interesting because she says, I dreaded that first robin so. So why is she scared of it? What does the robin represent? Really interesting stuff to look into there if you choose her for your discussion board post. So choose one of these 5 texts, just one, and talk about what the terrifying images or monsters or villains in it represent. What kind of fear could they represent? And this is a theme that will carry through as we start to look at Macbeth and Dracula in the next unit. So this concludes our unit on poetry and mythology, and we've moved from the ancient myths to the early centuries AD with Beowulf, and we'll be moving up to the Renaissance next week. So we're charging forward in time, or not next week, in the next lesson. So continue to think about this concept of community and fear as we look at the communities and the villains, which obviously Macbeth and Dracula are filled with terrifying images and villains. So keep that concept in mind. Remember, we can learn about the community and thus about the primary world by thinking about the fears and the fears that are represented by the villains.